Good evening, everyone. My name is Corey McLeod, and I'm the publisher of InnovationAus.com. I will be your MC for this evening, the last lecture of Professor Mazzucato's Australian Speaking Tour. Welcome, everyone. A little bit of housekeeping. Bathrooms are outside and right to the back, pretty much where you came in for many of you. You should also have a link to the Menti app in your confirmation email, or you can download it from the QR codes that you will find around the room. Before we begin, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, on which we meet today, and of the lands where you join us from today, all over Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people who are in the room tonight. These events don't take place without the support of our partners. We're here at Melbourne University today, who've been a wonderful partner, and we're hosting this last lecture, which I know people have been very much looking forward to. There's a whole range of partners. I think we've got a slide up here we can show you in a second. The Department of Industry, Science and Resources, the CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, Australian Computer Society. There are many. It has been a coalition of the willing, as we like to say, of bringing together organisations that really understand how important it is at this moment in time to host the professor in Australia and hear from her about what she's seeing in the world, but also to take away a little bit of insight and energy in terms of some of the challenges and opportunities that we're facing right now. So thank you to our partners. I'd like to welcome all of those people who are joining us from live stream today. So can you put a round of applause together for everyone who is in the far-flung reaches of Australia? I think you will hear from the professor a little bit later about how important it is to bring communities along, regions. Australia's a big country, and we're in lots of different parts of the country, but for us to pull together is incredibly important when there are moments of opportunity. So people joining us in the live stream, you are in the room with us, and we look forward to hearing questions from you a little bit later. I'd like to start now by introducing the CEO of Breakthrough Victoria to say a few words. Grant Dooley, welcome.
Thanks very much, Corey. It's a real pleasure to be partnering with your organisation in bringing the esteemed professor here to Australia. So thanks, Corey. Just like you did, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and country and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land across Victoria, their elders, past, present and emerging. It's funny, this is the third time I've got to hang out with the professor since she's arrived, and I think I've become a bit of a fanboy. She saw me downstairs in a VIP room. She goes, "You following me around?" And I think I am following her around at the moment. We had the dinner last night, then we had a round table of government today, and here I am again today hanging out with you again, Mariana, but I'm sure everyone else will be just as impressed as I have been with what you've been saying and the message you're trying to deliver. As you've been told, I'm the CEO of Breakthrough Victoria, and we're an investment manager established by the state government, and in that regard we are very much a mission-led organisation. We invest to drive innovation and create social and environmental benefit in areas of government priority and societal need. And really to illustrate this, we've made 21 investments to date. Okay, and the great thing about my job, I get to work with some fantastic people, some of which are here today, but we also get to see some of the impact we're making. We've invested in Aravax, which is a peanut allergy company, and I got to meet the lovely lady and her daughter who is actually, she suffers from the peanut allergy. And it's when you're doing these type of investments and you get to meet them firsthand, that you really get a sense of what we're trying to do at Breakthrough Victoria. We've invested in Smart Paddock, which has bluebell tags for cows that would be tracked around their paddocks, and also to try and find how they're actually usage and also the health of the animal. And that is another great investment around how we're trying to actually improve our livestock production and also actually make better use of our scarce resources on the land itself. We invest in quantum computing companies like Quantum Brilliance. Okay, so Breakthrough is very mission-led, and we're being led by what we see as our mandate. And that really is to drive innovation for change and impact for the state of Victoria. And it's with that probably in mind that when we were approached to actually support this tour, we were very keen to do so, because at the very heart of what the professor talks about is being mission-led. And I think organisations like Breakthrough Victoria, like the National Reconstruction Fund, that's really what we're about, being mission-led to drive societal change and impact. Now, you're not here to listen to me speak, so I think I'd like to hand over to, I'm handing over to Corey, who's going to actually let someone from the university have, I think it's Mark actually, the next word. So thank you very much. I'm glad you all came out today to be here and to listen to what is going to be, I dare say, a very interesting lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant. I'd also like to introduce the Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Mark Hargraves at Melbourne University. He's the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research Collaboration. Collaboration is a word that you'll hear often, and research collaboration is incredibly important to a country like ours. Professor Hargraves, welcome.
Thanks very much, Corrie. On behalf of the university, welcome to our campus. Can I too acknowledge the Wurundjeri as the traditional owners of these lands and as the original innovators, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples watching in the room or watching. It's a great It's a great pleasure to welcome you here. The university, indeed all of the universities in Melbourne and Victoria, we're blessed with very many high quality universities are interested in education, which is where we have a big impact, but also in our research. And translating that research for economic and social benefit is an important part of what we do. We're very much investigator driven, but also we focus in particular areas, and we do so with our research partners around this precinct, and we're very fortunate to have some outstanding research and translation institutions in this precinct. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to the University of Melbourne, Mariana. You've got friends and colleagues here with whom I know you interact. I'm very much looking forward to your lecture tonight. Welcome all, enjoy the evening, and thank you.
It gives me great pleasure because there's a little bit I wanted to fill you in about the trip that we've had this week. And so before I properly introduce Professor Mazzucato, I thought it would be worth giving you a little bit of a short snapshot of the week. It started off with a meeting with Treasurer Jim Chalmers on Monday morning, and some meetings with New South Wales Treasurer Daniel Mookie, and a packed out lecture at UTS, nowhere near as good looking as the crowd I'm looking at today, I must say. We had a lunch in Sydney with Minister Husick talking about National Reconstruction Fund and a whole range of other things, and that was a brilliant lunch. Mariana met with Independent Senator and former Wallabies captain David Pocock about engaging community and procurement reform, which is a pretty cool meeting. It's actually interesting to see a former Wallaby and a rockstar economist having, a drink together. And last night, the forum, which some of you may have been at, with Victorian Treasurer Tim Pallas and the Chair of the National Reconstruction Fund, Martine Wilder, in addition to a number of other people. Between all of this, there was a briefing with secretaries in Canberra and also another briefing and workshop with secretaries in Victoria. And I think it's given not just the people that had part of these events and these workshops a new lens and some energy in which to look at the challenges and opportunities, but I think it's given Mariana an opportunity to really get to know Australia and where we sit at this particular junction in time. And I think that's what makes this lecture really special, is that she's been on a jam-packed schedule, and tonight she is going to give you her lecture, which I'm very much looking forward to. Please welcome Mariana Mazzucato.
Thank you, Corrie. Thank you. Thank you. This is the first time that I wear bifocals. I've never worn them. So I see you, and then I look down. Yes, it works. Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, and I don't want that just to be a tokenistic comment in the beginning. I would love to find a way to actually really respect that concept throughout the talk. What does it actually mean to bring voice to how we govern this concept of mission-orientedness, right? If the economy is not just a rate, but a direction, if we want that direction to be good for people and planet, if we use words like inclusive growth and sustainable growth, and we try to land the sustainable development goals in ways that make sense to local places, whose voices are actually at the table when we govern our mission-oriented policies, when we govern our mission-oriented institutions. And I will thank the Breakthrough Institute in just a second and the university, but let me just finish this bit because I think it's so important. Whose voices are actually at the table ex ante, in a pre-distributive way, as opposed to ex post, explaining why it's very important for communities and acknowledging all the different people that, of course, we know are important. So for me, that's really important, not just here, but also where I live, in London, in Italy, where I'm from, in the US, which right now is about to go through civil war, depending what actually happens. But there's huge disenchantment with the so-called elites, with how decisions are made. And I think this discussion with you today and this whole week has been very important also to wake me up, to really understand just how important recognizing traditional owners of the land in terms of knowledge, in terms of the innovation, Mark, how you just said it was the first time I've actually heard it this week. That this is about innovation, traditional innovation. We shouldn't just go back to it. We need to recognize it and put it at the center. So with that, can I just give a big thanks to Mark and this university. It's really great to be here. I can't remember actually where I was when I was here last, 5 years ago. Which auditorium was it? Does anyone know? Anyone was here? Anyway, I do remember that Glenn Davis was with me on stage, and since then he's been upgraded to other positions. But last time I was in Melbourne was about 6 years ago. And it's wonderful to be back, and I'm especially grateful to all the sponsors and the Breakthrough, Victoria, and actually this conversation. It's really interesting when some of the funders are also trying to do what I'm talking about, right? This isn't just money funding events, it's actually a struggle, it's a battle. And that's really also how I want to begin, which is this whole concept that I'll be talking about today. I guess the slides at some point will come up. Yes, good. Do I see them? Yes. Should actually make us all feel uncomfortable if it's about doing things differently, right? If things were rosy, we wouldn't have to do things differently. We wouldn't be here. Or you'd be here and be very bored. And maybe you are bored, so I shouldn't put it that way. But so, if we all recognize that there's these challenges out there from the water crisis, the global hydrological cycle is at risk. We have global warming, with all its symptoms. You've had your own massive symptoms, which have woken people up to just how urgently we have to act. We had the health pandemic, which made us realize just how unprepared we are in terms of battling global health pandemics. We weren't ready in any way. We weren't ready with the digital divide problem. So many kids globally stopped accessing their human rights to education, right, because of the digital divide during the lockdown. We weren't ready with the PPE, the personal protection equipment. We weren't ready with vaccinating the world. We got a bunch of vaccines. We didn't vaccinate the world. We ended up with vaccine nationalism. We weren't ready with test and trace. In the country where I live, the UK, we ended up paying Deloitte. I'll come back to Deloitte and McKinsey later. 1.5 million a day to do our test and trace, and it failed. It wasn't surprising because, in fact, they have no expertise on test and trace, but that's another story. So we weren't prepared, and what's really depressing is we're no more prepared now because all these recovery funds, the Build Back Better funds that globally were kind of sprayed into the system didn't actually, at least in my opinion, strengthen our capacity, our capability to govern these problems collectively. So given that these are the challenges and we're so unprepared, if we're going to have an outcomes-oriented mission economy, it means really doing things differently. And so we should feel a bit edgy, a bit uncomfortable in these conversations. And that's why I always warn that if these kinds of conferences, events, and conversations are all about kind of being chummy with each other and saying, oh, how cool, an economist is coming around telling us about this kind of new economic way of thinking and smiling, then probably we haven't really understood the radical changes that need to happen in terms of how we govern all the different types of organizations in the public, the private, the civil society space, and how they work together. So for me, really, that's the background, that this is an important conversation because of these global challenges and how they've landed in cities and regions and countries and the globe. And it's very important in terms of underpinning the solution with new economic thinking, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because as an economist, I really recognize the static, the defunct economic thinking that has contributed to our inertia and inability to act with speed, with urgency, with ambition and boldness. But also the real need to also recognize that it's going to be hard. This is going to be about experimenting also with a new way to actually govern our capitalist system, if we can use that big, bold word, but also really learning locally. I mean, that's why it's really great also this conversation we had this morning, you were there as well, with the state government. So many times the learnings we have of how to do things differently actually come from local entities, from cities, from states, and we really ideally want those lessons to then get scaled up at the federal and the global level, and the money to do the reverse, right, come down to those local entities. But that idea of experimenting, learning by doing, trial and error is extremely important in this, and it might be that therefore we need to recognize that there will be mistakes along the way. So that appetite also for risk-taking, so important. But during this week, it's been interesting how I've heard continuously the recognition that there's not just these kind of big global challenges that have landed here and everywhere in terms of climate, biodiversity, water, health, but also real structural issues in terms of how the economic system currently has in some ways been rewarding an inertial system. And this morning I asked, is there actually a good diagnosis of why the system is sick before we try to look at the solutions when we use words like the rentier economy, certain companies and large monopolies, but also large, perhaps public agencies being part of that problem in terms, again, of how they're governed, how profits have been made, how those profits have not been reinvested back into the economy to make the system, again, more inclusive, sustainable, more innovative. And it seems to me that that's really a big first step to do before we look at solutions. But we talk a lot about the low productivity in Australia, but I come from Italy where we've had 30 years of falling productivity. Where does productivity come from? Investment by both public and private actors. So the productivity problem is also an investment problem, and it's not surprising actually that in this country, as also in Italy and also the UK, we have below average business investment, below average public investment in all those key drivers of long-term growth. So what's ironic is that even if you reduce your deficit, debt to GDP might rise, in fact often does rise, because if you're not investing in what actually determines the long-run growth of what's in the denominator, remember from basic maths, x over 0 is infinity, you can actually end up with a low deficit, but a very high and rising debt to GDP. Debt to GDP actually in this country is not even such a big deal, but that's really not the point. It's not like a magic number, what's right, what's wrong. It's where is the source of growth? What is the direction of growth? Is there a recognition that actually that's a key part of the problem in terms of low productivity? And if we set up productivity commissions that look then just at that number and think of it as creating a more frictionless economy, as opposed to really paying attention to the quality of the investments that we need to raise productivity, then we end up with just talking about productivity years in, years out. It's quite recognized that this country has a low level of complexity in terms of how overly reliant it is on extractive sectors. How do we diversify an economy? Well, that's not going to happen without actually admitting where these rents are coming from and where the lobbying for those rents to continue are coming from. But it's obvious this is not the only country that has that problem. Falling R&D, not just low R&D. And also this whole issue that innovation itself is an outcome of a collective process. It's not just about increasing R&D in the public sector, increasing R&D in the private sector. It really is about recognizing that innovation is based on collaboration, it's based on collective intelligence, it's based on partnerships. So we're really paying attention to the structure of partnerships, the structure of ecosystems, and whether those ecosystems are part of the problem. The word partnership and ecosystem isn't a neutral word. You can have a bad partnership, as many of you might know from your past love lives. You can have ecosystems that are parasitic, that are mutualistic, that are symbiotic. Are we good at knowing the difference? Do we have proper metrics? This is one of my critiques of the concept of stakeholder value, which has just been seen as a corporate governance issue as opposed to an interrelational issue, right? What does it mean to really work well together and to have metrics that tell us if, for example, one of the vaccines collaborations that we had in COVID might have been different from some of the other collaborations with the vaccines precisely based on the partnership. And I've been talking about this for some time because I think the AstraZeneca partnership with Oxford University, that ecosystem that they set up with all those different researchers, was a much more fruitful and one based on reciprocity, based on the negotiation, the tense negotiation that came about from that partnership when Oxford insisted that knowledge be shared, that costs and prices remain low. Why? Because you want the vaccine to be produced also in the developing world, precisely because it's a global pandemic. So the word partnership, ecosystem, we need to kind of break it down. And Australia is the lowest ranked OECD nation for cooperative research and innovation. And 80% of Australian businesses did not introduce any new goods or services in that period that you see up there on the screen. But that itself, what does that mean to actually tackle that problem? It's also a country that is super financialized. Again, you're not the only one. I come from the UK where 80% of our finance goes back to finance. Finance is financing finance. It goes back to fire. So it's not just the climate that's on fire, our finance is on fire. Finance, insurance, and real estate, right? That has been very much part of the global financial crisis was actually caused by private debt. We ended up forgetting that, and in some parts of the world, we just went on to this rampage of austerity, cutting public debt as though that's what actually caused the financial crisis, but it was private debt. And when you have a system, financialized system of housing, for example, as you do here, as we do in the UK, as the US has, where we're over-indebting people with mortgages while we're not actually constructing enough new homes, let alone new homes that are sustainable. I'm going to be very grateful to Dan Hill when he comes up later on stage with me. He and I are actually working on this, and we'll talk about it later. What does it mean to tackle housing, not just in terms of cement and steel and more homes, but really to think of community creation, sustainability in the materials, but also sustainability as an area of contestation. What do we even mean by that around housing and social housing? But you being a school of design and architecture here, you know about this much more than I do. But when we see housing just as a crisis and make it easier to buy homes during a crisis periods and just flood the system with more finance and more debt, we are basically laying the groundwork for another financial crisis. And I don't want to depress you. I promise at some point I'll become really positive in about 5 minutes, I think. But it's amazing how very few people, including the Financial Times and our financial papers, are talking about this. But the level of private debt to disposable income in many countries is back to the level it was when the financial crisis burst. And that's what caused the financial crisis. So you'd think that we'd be really tackling this kind of stuff seriously, and it'd be at least part of electoral campaigns and debates. But the other thing is that when we have the wrong understanding of where innovation comes from and all these issues I just talked about, the collective intelligence, the collaboration, and if we just pretend that business wants to invest, but we just need to make it easier, get rid of the red tape, get rid of different rules and definancialize, or if we want R&D to happen, just make it easier for it to happen by introducing some tax incentives, and then, surprise, surprise, nothing happens. Why is that? Because actually what drives business spending on R&D, which again in this country is below average, it's both the public and the private R&D spending, which is below average in this country. And if we think it's enough to just reduce tax and introduce some sort of tax incentive, what ends up happening is that we end up increasing profits, because you've just reduce costs, but not necessarily investment, right? So how do we make sure that there's additionality in the system, that the kind of different policies we have truly make investments in R&D happen that would not have happened anyway? And what this graph here shows you is the difference between support that governments are providing businesses to do their R&D divided by direct support, through, for example, the breakthrough kinds of investments versus indirect support just through the tax system. By the way, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, is actually only done through tax, but that's a different story, which I'm sure we'll get a question later about the IRA. But just to say that there's different ways that governments can stimulate economies that are static, that are inertial, that are not complex enough. And if we have the wrong understanding of even what leads to business investment and innovation, we might end up actually be part of the problem, that you're just increasing profits in the system and not investment. And globally, in case you weren't aware, the profit share of global income is at a record level. There's no problem with global profits. There's a problem with global investment. Those profits are not getting reinvested in the economy. You can see this with one of the figures I just had up there with share buybacks in the US. Actually, if you look at I think I even have a slide on this. Oh, at some point it'll come. Over $7 trillion, 12 zeros, have been used in share buybacks by the top 500 companies in the world over the last 10 years. Some share buybacks are fine, but this excessive use of share buybacks to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay represents a lack of reinvestment of profits in the system. So it's not just finance that is financialized, finance, but our business community, when it's just been driven by maximizing shareholder value, has been financialized, and that process of definancializing business and really catalyzing public-private investment is something I'm going to be focusing on tonight. And I already opened up with this, the global heating, global warming, global boiling problem is huge. And if you read the IPCC report, it's very clear. We don't have time. This problem has to be solved quickly. What does it mean to treat it urgently, but also with long-term investments, right? So you want to do something urgently, but not so quick that you're not thinking it through. That real need to tackle our climate problem at the center of how we actually design our economy is simply not happening. There were so many subsidies during COVID. A lot of those subsidies actually went to projects and companies fueled by fossil fuels. Australia is no different, actually, from other countries. But the need to actually transition isn't just about renewable energy. It's about everything. It's what we eat, how we move, how we build. Again, you guys, at least in the school, deal a lot with building the built environment. The environment is an outcome of how we build. And that means that the sustainability agenda really has to go through everything. And I'll come back to that. But in order to do that, in order to kind of tackle these structural issues in our economy, in order to tackle rent-seeking in the economy where profits are being made without investment, profits without production, in order to get government to kind of do its proper job instead of just incentivizing, facilitating, de-risking, and just making the system even more inertial, it really requires a new story of the ills in the country, diagnosing the sickness before we come up with solutions, but also very much a new story of how the economy works. And not just the economy, but as an economist, I'll focus on that because that's what I know, or think I know. And a lot of my work has really been focused on this idea that it's not by coincidence that we have the problems we do, it's by design. There's nothing deterministic in how the economy works. It's an outcome of decisions that are made, of governance structures that we can change, which is the good news, actually. I mean, that is the first piece of good news I've just told you, that we can actually reverse, move forwards in a very different way, but really first recognizing why we have this inertia. And in terms of public entities and how they're governed, and this actually came up a lot this week, if at best, at worst, government get out of the way, but when you've got adults in the room, we tend not to talk that way. If at best the adults in the room think that their role is just to fix different types of market failures, then by design, we are too little too late. By design, we are patching things up. By design, it's just incremental change and doesn't lead to transformational change. Stronger health systems, well-being at the center of our economies, really tackling the climate crisis throughout everything, definancializing the system. That's transformational change. If we're just tinkering, thinking that even the notion of the public good, which sounds good, because there's two words and one is good, is actually just a correction for something that the private sector hasn't done, right? If those of you who've taken Econ 101, when goods are non-excludable and non-rival, and when you have strong positive externalities, so the benefits are really open to many, then you have underinvestment by the private sector in that good, like basic research and development. So the public sector has to come in and fill that gap, or clean water, or defense systems. Bads that have negative externalities, the opposite of positive externalities, what does the government have to do? Come in and put another patch, a carbon tax, right? So all these are real market failures, but if we see everything as a market failure, perhaps we've actually designed these markets in a problematic way if the failures are so prevalent, but also if the point then of our public institutions are just to put little bandages here and there, whether it's correcting for positive or negative externalities or asymmetric information, what Joe Stiglitz got the Nobel Prize for. He later became more heterodox, but he did some really great advancements in pretty mainstream economic thinking. So asymmetric information is a classic market failure. That's why small companies don't get financed. So SME financing is framed as correcting for that asymmetric information. So all these things need to be done: funding basic research and development, carbon taxes, SME financing. But if they're framed as correcting market failures, it's not surprising then that the skills we think we need are literally the skills of patching things up. In fact, MPA programs, Masters in Public Administration programs, are very different from Masters in Business Administration programs. Why? Because we admit that businesses create value. They're not just there to patch things up, right? So we have strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior. There's textbooks called Rejuvenating the Mature Corporation. So this need for creativity and thinking out of the box and resisting inertia is kind of central to what you learn in business schools. And if you look at the curriculum, literally, of the MPA programs, it's how to fix, how to make sure you're not crowding out, how, when you're doing something good, it's still called crowding, but in. Like literally the vocabulary is completely negative. And this idea of de-risking, enabling, facilitating, lender of last resort, as opposed to what? Lender of first resort, de-risking instead of what? Taking on the risk, sharing rewards. So we don't have that kind of more active, proactive, not just narrative, but underlying framing. And this is a huge problem. And as I mentioned, this isn't just obviously about public or private, but the governance structures and all the different entities which create value need to be examined. So that kind of rentiership that I talked about, the excessive share buybacks actually come from a governance structure. So unless we actually go to the heart of the problem and question how come we, since the 1980s, basically have allowed large corporates to be governed by just maximizing shareholder value, and that could be a whole lecture, so I won't go into that, unless we actually go into the source in the theory of shareholder value maximization. And if I had more time, I'd tell you where that came from and why it's just even theoretically very problematic. This idea that shareholders are the residual claimants. So everyone else has a guaranteed rate of return, except the shareholders. Workers get salaries, banks get interest rates, and so on. And the shareholders taking the most risk, so as the residual claimant. That idea from Michael Jensen back at Harvard Business School is actually just wrong from the start. No one has a guaranteed rate of return. Workers often take risks when they start working and might think they have a lifetime career, but don't. The public sector takes on, as I wrote about a lot in the entrepreneurial state, huge amounts of risks where some things succeed, some things don't, but we don't think of it that way, and it's a vicious cycle, then we don't actually set things up that way. But no one really has a guaranteed rate of return. Anyway, shareholder value maximization instead of what? This concept of stakeholder value, which is increasingly catchy. Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, writes a letter every year to all his CEOs saying, oh God, we need to do better, we need to invest in communities, we need to invest in workers, ex post, right? So stakeholder value, as I mentioned before, if it's really going to debunk and change this problem of shareholder value maximization, needs to be about creating value differently ex ante, how all the different actors, capital-labor relations, public-private, real respect for communities, the voice of all the different actors in the community at the table ex ante, that's really not actually happening. And for that to happen, we really do need to change the story. This was the slide I was looking for before. Not sure why it's there. Oh, it's there because shareholder value maximization actually leads to this excess amount of share buybacks, which has been shown to be linked very much to these different symptoms, if you want, of financialization being linked to inequality. Because if companies aren't reinvesting their profits back into production and are engaging in excessive dividend payments and share buybacks, which, as I just mentioned, increase share prices, stock options, and executive pay, who's not benefiting? The workers inside those companies. It's not surprising that wages have not been increasing over the last year since the 1980s, along with productivity, because if wealth is being created by different actors, but a lot of that wealth gets siphoned out, something that the classical economists, Smith, Ricardo, and Karl Marx thought a lot about, then we have a problem. Smith, by the way, was so much more intelligent than anyone gives him credit for. All these right-wing think tanks that are called the Smith Institute or whatever, I often am on TV with them, the token lefty, the token righty, and sometimes I try to upset them by saying, did you actually ever open up any of his books. It's not just that he also talked about morality, the theory of moral sentiments, and didn't just talk about the free market, but the definition of the free market in Smith was not free from the state, it was free from rent. Free from rent. Already the physiocrats in the 1700s were very worried, these were the first economists ever, basically, worried about rent. They called the landlords at the time, modern landlords are basically the tech industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the financial sector, but at the time they were literally the landlords, and the physiocrats called them the sterile class, because they looked at the system in a biological way, and they said when all this money is getting extracted out, the system won't reproduce itself. So they believed that farmers created value, and if that value was not reinvested back in, but was siphoned out by both the merchant class and the landlords, just to dress themselves nicely or to fight wars, then the system wouldn't reproduce. So it was interesting that they used these kind of biological metaphors. But we stopped doing that, and I wrote about this in The Value of Everything. Actually, here, good, the self-promotional slide here. In The Value of Everything, where I kind of went back and looked at the history of political economy and how value was understood and how we've kind of confused now value with price. And even when we use words like stakeholder value, which is supposed to be a good thing, versus shareholder value, it's not really going back to rethinking value creation in that pre-distributive way. I won't talk about what I've said in all these books, but the common thread has been that if we get stuck thinking that value is only created in the private sector, needs to be facilitated and enabled by the public sector, we get the wrong public institutions, we get very problematic public-private relationships that are easy to capture, we get bad policy design, we get really bad collaborations. I mean, all the problems I'm interested in, I'm sure you're interested in, need all sorts of different entities, public, private, civil society, trade unions working well together. So we need to kind of debunk words like entrepreneurialism, so it's not just about the business sector, but entrepreneurial systems. What is an entrepreneurial system? We need mission economy, not just to be a grandstanding concept, but as I'll talk about in a minute, it has to land on specific ways in which we work together in an outcomes-oriented way. And I'll be talking about that in a second. And the big con, which in theory, I was sort of here to talk about because you guys have been the most affected by this ultra-consultification of our governments, whether it was your McKinsey scandal where $6 million was paid to McKinsey to do your climate strategy that did not work out too well, PwC, which more recently, lots of, facts have come out on just how incredible it is when you have a consulting company working on both sides of the street, right? So consulting with the medical device companies and with the regulators of the medical device companies, or in South Africa with Eskom, big state-owned enterprise for energy, and with the energy regulator. But for us, it wasn't just about accusing the consultants. It was actually saying, what has happened to governments that have reduced their capacity to such an effect that they both need others to come and do the core job of government, or even when they know how to do the core job of government, they're so risk-averse and scared, because their role is just to fix markets, and they're not allowed to experiment, that it's easy just to rubber stamp it with a consultant. I'll come back to that problem in a second. The new book I'm writing, so I'll come back here in 5 years, is actually about why all of this, another big kind of area for me, is that unless we underpin it with a new type of economics, that's not just at best about the public good, which is correcting for something the private sector doesn't do, as I mentioned before, but needs to be much more than that. It needs to be objective-oriented, not correction-oriented, and the how matters as much as the what, because of all these relationships along the way. In fact, the common good in ancient philosophy is actually a relational concept. It's about how we work together, how we relate one to another. It's actually interesting, in ancient Greek, the word idiot literally comes from when we just have no sense of the public, of what's around us, when it's just a private being. But the common good economics for me is absolutely central. I'm not going to talk about it too much now, because otherwise you won't invite me back in 5 years. You'll think you've heard it. But this for me is very much actually going to go through what I'll talk about in my remaining, oh good, I've got at least 20 minutes left. They gave me 45 minutes. We're good, right? Yes, good. Came all the way here. You can't shut me up that quickly. But the common good is about what are our collective challenges, whose voices are at the table, right? Even saying what those challenges are. So this idea of a common objective with real co-creation, ex ante, even defining those objectives, a product of collective interactions, learning, co-investments, shared resources. So this idea that I put out in this recent article, if you're interested, the citation is here, is that we then need to hold the system accountable through these different principles, admitting that there's directionality. Nothing is neutral. As I said before, partnerships can be parasitic or symbiotic. That itself is a direction that we're setting. So talking about purpose and directionality, talking about co-creation, whose voices are at the table, doing serious participation, as opposed to just tokenistic consultations, collective learning and knowledge sharing, precisely because innovation is based on that, access for all and reward sharing, ex ante, as opposed to just creating value problematically, and ex post, focusing so much on redistribution. I believe in redistribution and progressive taxation, but why do we have to spend so much time and energy on redistribution? Because we're actually creating value problematically, again, ex ante. There's a good article, which it's going to take me too long to explain to you what's in it, but it's good, by, I can't even remember his name, a Chilean economist at Cambridge, which has shown also just how much money we waste on redistributive policies because we're getting the value creation wrong ex ante. And of course, transparency and accountability, and that's of course also where this consultification of government has one of its biggest problems. So what do I mean by mission-orientedness? Because the word itself can mean lots of things. It could just mean vision. It could mean a challenge. It could mean our, big global objectives. And for me, it actually is a serious concept which has helped me think through why the system isn't working in an outcomes-oriented way. So I want to give you some examples, but I want to also explain why I found it so interesting, actually, to begin with, something that happened 50 years ago, which was the classic mission, which was the Apollo program. The problems we face today are much harder than any space race. We've got wicked problems. That's the sexy word that people use. In other words, we need not just technological change, behavioral change, regulatory change, but my point is we would never have gotten to the moon today using the types of policy frameworks, types of relationships, types of public-private rentiership, if that's how public and private work together for the Apollo program. And even just the whole language that was used. If we say that the reason we have so much consultification of our governments is due to this risk averseness, really interesting to look at the language that was used around risk for the Apollo program. The famous speech that Kennedy gave at Rice Stadium, but also to the Irish Parliament when he said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. That means embracing difficulty. It means embracing uncertainty. They knew they had to work with lots of different companies. It was state-directed, but a lot of bottom-up innovation in so many different sectors. So beginning with the challenge, turning it into a mission that's really clear and targeted, bold, inspirational, but targeted. Did you do it or not? There's conspiracy theorists who say it never happened, but lots of different sectors, right? Nutrition, materials, electronics. And the first thing they did was actually change the tools that government had. So it was a political economy feat. That's what interested me, not the aerospace bit. Political economy feat, because they realized they would have never gotten to the moon if they didn't have this outcomes-orientedness in their policies. So the first thing they did was change how procurement was done. And in fact, it was because, let me just go to the procurement one, because they took procurement seriously, the first thing they did was change the design of procurement from cost plus, just thinking of the lowest cost, get the lowest cost bidder, towards fixed price, challenge oriented with incentives, so you'd get more for innovation and quality improvement. And it was that kind of redesign of such an important tool of how they were going to work with the private sector that then stimulated so much innovation that got us all these spillovers along the way. All the homework problems. The big mission was to the moon and back in a short amount of time, so urgency, because they wanted to beat the Russians. But had they just said, beat the Russians, space race, Sputnik, just stop there, that would be like today just stopping at the SDGs. No hunger, no poverty, gender parity, right? They turned it into a mission, to the moon and back in a short amount of time. And to do that, lots of homework problems. What would the astronauts wear? How would they eat? How would they go to the bathroom, right? So baby formula, home insulation, baby diapers, software, all these got 20 up here, CAT scans, water purification system, wireless headset, all these different spillovers that happen along the way were because how government and business were working together was basically on homework problems. Why did that happen? Because they actually spent time changing the design of the tool in order to do that. And they also, because they were confident of their role, they weren't de-risking the private sector. They weren't facilitating the private sector. They were working with the private sector. They also said, dudes, we're not going to turn this into a gambling machine. No excess profits, no rents. Inflation today, what is causing it? Excess profits in the energy sector, in the food sector. They were clear about that, like the classical political economists were. Adam Smith, free market, free from rent. So just so interesting that they actually thought about this. And the guy who actually designed procurement, his name was Ernest Brackett, and he also came up with this wonderful quote. He realized that already back in the 1960s, NASA was working too much with consultants. So NASA had to work with the private sector. But how do you work with the private sector? Which private sector companies do you work with? How do you write the terms of reference? How do you write the contracts? What are you going to do together? How do you do outcomes-oriented procurement? That needs capacity and capability. And he said, if we continue to outsource our brain, we're going to get captured by brochuremanship. It was an endearing word because there was no sexy PowerPoints like the ones I'm using tonight. They just had these nice, shiny brochures that a company might come in to work with NASA. And they said, Ernest Brackett said, we won't even know how to differentiate, a company that's just kind of bullshitting and saying, I'm going to do this with you. Maybe they have no expertise from the ones that actually we can really work with because they have either a history of success in an area, or we just think that we can design a collaboration with this company in an interesting way on the specific challenges that we can set together. It wasn't a perfect system, but the fact that they worked with 400,000 people, lots of different companies, lots of different sectors, for Ernest Brackett was central. And basically what I've then started working on with missions on the ground, the examples, different countries, different cities, different regions, tried to learn from that. What would it look like if we were just as ambitious, treated with equally amount urgentness, we're honest about the difficulty, the experimentation that's required, the level of uncertainty that we need to embrace, sharing risks, sharing rewards, not creating all these rents in the system, by putting our global challenges, which are the Sustainable Development Goals, not because I'm telling you they are, but because your country has signed up to them. Every country has basically, since 2015, signed up to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, have them land in your country in a way that makes sense, in your cities, in your regions, in your states. That needs to be negotiated, right? That's also why political processes are very important in terms of, the political process should also be where we elect politicians who we think have a vision at that very high level. But if it just remains at that high level, we just get blah, 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 blah. And that's what, Greta Thunberg, she was 16 at the time. Now I don't know how old she is, but she's older. Still have Fridays for the Future, teenagers telling us that we have just lost so much time and we're blah, blah, blank. The geopolitical crisis that we're also experiencing right now, I think, has been a huge wake-up call to them that the history books will talk about. So teenagers are impatient. We're not. If your house is on fire, you don't sit there and say, what am I going to do? Should I choose one kid, bring them out? You try to bring out the kids, might have some time to bring out the photographs and your mother's quilts, but you don't sit there and wait. Whereas how we're addressing these global challenges isn't with that level of urgency. And it's not a surprise, actually, that Apollo moon mission came out of the military-industrial complex. Why? We're used to, with military-industrial complexes, treating war, right, as a mission and actually wanting to win the war and using outcomes orientation. The Defense Production Procurement Act that Biden used during COVID came out of the Korean War. And he used it because COVID was seen in many countries, including here, as a war. There was war rooms, millions of people were dying. And so we woke up and used outcomes-oriented procurement for PPE, for vaccines, but that's not the normal way we work. So missions are about turning grand challenges into clear, bold, inspirational missions to the moon and back in a short amount of time. What does that mean for climate? What does it mean for health? What does it mean for the water crisis? What does it mean for health and well-being? What does it mean for, in London, where we have a huge problem of knife crime and inequality, which are linked amongst our youth? What does it mean to treat that problem with equal urgency, saying 0 knife crime in the next whatever amount of time, because we're going to treat it seriously in an interdepartmental way and get as many different actors to the table to think about that. So it's not obviously just about our technological problems, but my whole interest actually increasingly is how do we also treat our social problems in that way. Getting as many different sectors as possible. So climate change is not just about renewable energy, it's about everything, right? Nutrition, materials, how we move. But that key bit about those bottom-up projects, that doesn't just happen by talking about bottom-up projects. We need to redesign our tools, procurement, loans, grants, any government tool to crowd in that bottom-up experimentation. In Europe, I had the luck to be listened to, so now there's a missions instrument through that report that you see there. But it's actually pennies. They have about 30 billion that they're using across Europe for this idea of mission-orientedness. In the US, just the Department of Health, the National Institutes of Health, spend 40 billion a year in this direct kind of way around health missions. They then forget to make sure that people have access to that, and I'll come back to that later, but at least they have had, the US, the reason I wrote The Entrepreneurial State is that it's completely false that the US is this market-driven system. The US has had the most visible hand, but it's just been invisible in the discourse. Huge amounts of public investment in mission-oriented ways, mainly, but not only, in the military-industrial complex. But this idea of actually turning challenges into missions like a plastic-free ocean, like net zero cities, and then designing policies that bring those different sectors together in bottom-up experimentation. What does that mean for industrial strategy, for example? So in the UK, I worked very closely with the government there back in 2017 to help them transform the industrial strategy away from just sectors that were getting a lot of handouts, life sciences, aerospace, automotive, finance, in the creative sector, towards a challenge-oriented system. And set up a commission, actually, Dan Hill, who's here, I invited him to be part of this commission, turning these challenges, which they chose, clean growth, future mobility, aging society, and the data economy, into concrete missions. And it was interesting that the fact that they actually had to be careful in the design of the mission, it wasn't as inspirational as to the moon and back, but when you have criteria that are specific, so you can actually say yes or no, did you achieve it? And when those criteria are ambitious, like having a congestion-free, admission-free, zero accident system that is also accessible, then some of these bottom-up projects would be, for example, in the world of disabilities. So this is about stimulating investment in innovation across many different sectors. It requires thinking about these areas not in a sectoral way, not only in terms of the private sector, but also in terms of the government, right? So well-being is not just for health, the Department of Health. Climate is not just for the Department of Energy. As soon as you talk about sustainable mobility, right, you start actually requiring also government departments to work much better together. Interdepartmental thinking, alignment between different departments, and actually having missions on the top, right, as opposed to getting siloed in one department and having a minister come up with his or her random missions as pet projects is key. It's been very interesting to work with different governments on this. Recently, I've been working with Barbados because the Prime Minister there, Mia Mottley, is very ambitious, not just for her global work on rethinking the international financial architecture, but also for her own country, seeing it as a small island state, but a large ocean state, and putting those ambitions around the blue economy and the green economy at the center, also of how tourism is thought about with a new view of even what we mean by the good life, comfort. People think of the Caribbean as a great place to go, but what does it mean to actually have embedded within that an ambition to become a clean and beautiful large ocean state, championing sustainable development locally and globally with the goal of all domestic activities becoming 100% sustainable by 2035. This was their mission and the work that we did with them. It didn't come from me, but with the work we did with the civil servants through my institute at UCL. And what was very important there was then changing the relationship. So the hotel chains, which are famous in the Caribbean islands, what is then the obligation on the hotel chains during a lockdown, for example, when tourism is not happening, in terms of the subsidies that they're receiving and using that moment to actually reinvest their profits into the workforce and really taking seriously repurpose, reuse, recycle across all their different activities, proving that they can even use that lull time to be thinking about that, but also training workers to be thinking that way, as opposed to just when times are good, raking in the profits, and when times are bad, expecting different types of subsidies. So that was actually one of the issues that Mia Motley came up with. But what was really interesting was also this idea that there have to be principles, human rights principles, principles of justice at the center of how the different actors work. And more recently, through some work that I've done with the Council on Urban Initiatives, in the housing missions, where there are so many different actors that are critical for that in construction, the real estate sector, local councils, what does it mean to actually bring the idea of human rights to the center, because there's legal obligations, right, in the human rights principles, and all the different, just like I've been talking about procurement is a contract. Intellectual property rights are contracts. Water rights have contracts. So taking seriously the embedding within the different contracts of these different actors in the system, some principles. And I was just talking with Jane, I don't know where you are, there you are, this idea of also taking seriously the customary rights of First Nations, for example, as a really important way to start thinking of missions in this country, but really in any country, as we were talking before, there's so many First Nations around the world, actually going back to this idea that there's customary rights that we can learn from, putting them, embedding them at the center of this co-creation process, and almost rediscovering what it actually means to have common good principles at the center. And human rights, of course, this was a paper that I did with Leilani Farha, who's also in the Council of Urban Initiatives. She was the UN envoy for human rights, and just really thinking of the rights to housing across different types of human rights principles of affordability, cultural adequacy, sustainability, security of tenure, location, accessibility. This means that you end up putting pressure in the system. This is why I talked about we should all be feeling a bit edgy and uncomfortable with a mission-oriented approach if the idea is that there's a challenge, a mission, different sectors, different departments, bottom-up innovation with, at the center of this collective intelligence, what does it mean to, at the center of that collective intelligence, really take care to embed this notion of symbiosis, reciprocity, and mutualism. I've been listening a lot to the different types of missions that have that are being explored in Australia with CSI. With CSIRO. It's very interesting to see the different ways that the missions are landing, and my reflection, and also talking to the colleagues that I spoke to here, is that there's interesting progress, but right now I think that there's some missing mission statements, right? Like there's a difference between challenges and missions, but also between missions and projects. And what happens is that you often have, like I've also seen in Europe, that, for example, when the European recovery, which is 2 trillion euros, is conditional, and member states having a plan for climate and digitalization, it was very easy for countries to come up with a bunch of projects. Who can't, right? You just make up a bunch of projects around digital and around climate, but if they're not aligned, then the sum is not greater than the parts. So this is why those mission statements that really then help think about that cross-sectoral collaboration and the interdepartmental coordination really then help create much more coherence and alignment between things that are already happening. Otherwise, the mission map is literally the reverse, just kind of raining down projects. I don't have much time, because as usual I go over time, but maybe just some insights on what this then means for the nitty-gritty, right? Not just the big policies like industrial policy and innovation policy, but also the design of institutions like the National Reconstruction Fund. It's not enough to have a fund, and it might sound good because it's a public fund and we want patient long-term finance, but at the center of these funds, this idea that actually there needs to be conditionality. In other words, if we're trying to move in a direction, then loans themselves should be conditional on the companies receiving those loans to prove that they are also moving in that direction. An interesting example in recent years was the KfW in Germany that provided a loan to the steel sector, conditional that the steel sector, kind of an old boring sector, innovate, wake up, get out of your inertia, lower the material content of production was a condition. How they did it was up to them. If you tell them how to do it, you micromanage, you stifle innovation. They did it through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology throughout the whole supply chain. We have green steel in Germany because of that. So conditionality embedded within public loan programs to make sure we're stimulating investment, especially in low investment economies, is very important. This was an article I wrote for the UN, which argued that, there's lots of public funds out there, actually. There's 24 trillion just in public banks between the multilateral development banks and the national development banks, but they're not aligned. So they're not actually working really for the public in that kind of, real public sense. So that greater alignment between the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, with the SDGs, having a stronger relationship with the national development banks around those SDG principles, but then they land in specific contexts, right, which are negotiated in different ways. But then key there is that the relationship with the private sector become kind of conditional with principles of reciprocity based on what is this for, right? So if we don't know what it's for, if there's no mission statement, like the Energiewende in Germany, then what you end up with is what we had in Italy, what we continue to have in Italy, which is the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti just gives out funds, public funds, patient funds, to companies that beg for money because they're having trouble, instead of it based on a condition for change, again, of additionality. That's, of course, where productivity comes from, right? That investment in technological and physical capital and human capital and training, that's where productivity comes from. So low investment countries are often low productive countries because of that. I had the luck to be asked by Nicola Sturgeon to think about this with the Scottish government. We set up the Scottish National Investment Bank that was using the SDGs kind of as a dashboard, where Scotland was using the SDGs as a dashboard, and it was very interesting how that dashboard then was reflected with this mission-oriented Scottish National Investment Bank. The problem was that after having set it up with my colleagues in the Institute, and we left, we just helped kind of frame how to do this. They brought in PwC to project manage it. And I said, what are you doing after all this work we've done? It's like, no, Mariana, don't worry, this is just the project management. We're like, what? That's like the doing, learning by doing. You have to invest, in-source in the civil service. So that was a bit depressing. But, again, all these moments for change, procurement, I've become obsessed with procurement. I was talking to Senator Pocock, is that how you pronounce his name? Rugby player, about the very important Pocock. Yeah, I just remember that he was very smart and good looking. And we talked about sport. We talked about the need for imagine if every stadium, right, a football stadium had these principles of sustainability, and we were competing even, which stadium was the greenest. And when I tell my kids that, they're like, Mom, come on, stop. This is not why we go to stadiums. But this idea that procurement, how you procure in, whether it's in a stadium, how you procure in schools, how you procure in for school meals in Sweden, something that Dan worked on. School meals in Sweden have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. All of a sudden, that means that the procurement budget for something as easy as school lunch becomes part of your innovation budget. In the UK, our whole innovation budget is 10 billion. Just the procurement budget for the transport ministry is 40 billion. So that becomes part of your innovation budget if what you're procuring is innovative, right? Again, not just lunch. Remember when Reagan said that ketchup was a vegetable? I had a T-shirt that had ketchup and Reagan and said, which is the vegetable? But if you do just have low-cost procurement, that's what you end up with. Ketchup is a vegetable. So the more ambitious you are with something as simple and normal, like school lunch, the more this becomes part of the innovation budget, which stimulates a more dynamic ecosystem of food around the school system. So there's really no stopping there. Democratization of procurement is something that the government of Colombia is thinking about. So again, how do we govern this? Whose voices are at the table? And ultimately, all of this requires us to evaluate these policies, right? There's no point in being really ambitious with outcomes-oriented procurement for school food or mission-oriented industrial strategy if then we go back and continue to use the old metrics, cost-benefit analysis, market failure fixing, net present value. So it's interesting coming back to that idea of spillovers along the way. What are the metrics that we need within our government institutions, within our treasuries, our finance ministries to evaluate whether indeed we're providing a catalytic stimulus to the economy that makes it more diversified, that makes it more investment-driven, investment with a direction that stimulates all those solutions to homework problems. And this was a recent paper I wrote with a colleague around actually measuring the multiplier effect through that way, but really what that also means for the evaluation methods is that we need metrics literally that would capture those dynamic spillovers and not just the static cost-benefit analysis. Had the moon landing been evaluated ex ante through some sort of cost-benefit analysis, it would have never happened. And this is why also productivity commissions have to really understand and think about what do we know that actually catalyzes that cross-sectoral investment that leads to those different solutions to problems, which historically have been the reasons we've ended up with technological change, right? Which is a key driver of productivity. The internet was a solution to a problem. No one ever said, we need the internet, it's a great thing. AI, quantum computing, the internet was a solution to the fact they needed the satellites to communicate. GPS was a solution to having to know where all the ships were in the seas. So let me just go quickly. Partnership with purpose, I've already talked about that, so I don't have to say much more. This idea that let's just stop using these blah, blah words like partnerships and ecosystem, embedding conditionality. Some people don't like that word because it's also been used in very problematic settings, including how the IMF and the World Bank have given loans to developing countries, which has had the opposite effect of everything I'm talking about, reducing the fiscal space. Conditionality really in terms of that idea of reciprocity. Ensuring that more citizens and businesses have access to specific goods, services, or technologies, direct investments towards social or environmental objectives, include profit sharing, that reinvestment of profits as opposed to just kind of extracting profits out through excessive dividend and share buyback schemes. It was very interesting. This is a paper I wrote with Danny Roderick at Harvard, but it was on the back of some lessons, for example, working with Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce in the US, where the CHIPS Act, for example, which is an industrial strategy. The US has always had industrial strategies, just never always pretended it didn't. The CHIPS Act, which is a modern industrial strategy in the US, it's about chip sovereignty, but embedded within it is that those companies benefiting from a $400 billion CHIPS program have to commit to reinvesting profits, to paying workers a living wage, to improving working conditions, and using energy-efficient supply chains. And again, whether it's in a bailout scheme, an industrial strategy, a procurement, a grant, or a loan, that moment to really say this isn't just about freebies. During COVID, countries like France put at the center of the bailout programs, for example, for Renault and Air France, that those companies had to commit over the next 5 years to reducing their carbon emissions. In the UK, we just gave out money. Because that's how things are done, through kind of backroom deals, the Nissan deal, the Jaguar deal. This was the EasyJet deal. They got $600 million during COVID, no conditions attached. So that's a cop-out. And this isn't about conditions top-down telling companies what to do. That, again, hurts innovation. But that idea, just like with the Apollo program, really bold problem, lots of homework problems, no excess profits, outcomes orientation, requires courage. Right? And it's very hard to have courage. I often say I walk in as an economist, come out as a life coach. I'm like, come on, man, like negotiate properly. It's hard to have courage if you don't know your self-worth, if you're insecure, if you're there to de-risk, to facilitate, to enable. That's why the narrative and the theory and the framing and how it lands on the practice really matters. Let me just quickly go to something that I've also found inspiring in the discussions here. And tomorrow, actually, we have our meeting with ACTU, and it's actually a broad cohort of organizations that I'll be meeting with. And it's been very interesting to see how this idea of missions is landing here. They have a mission map, which we don't have to go into the details, but what I found most interesting was that concept of justice at the center, right? So coming back to this idea of human rights principles, customary rights, but what are the principles of justice? First Nations justice, good jobs and training for all, most need, most risk, most support. You can read through this. The point is, without principles of how these different actors are going to work well together, we're not actually building back better. And that needs, again, negotiation. That's why capital, labor, public, private, this is all about kind of unpicking that fundamental underlying relationship. And lastly, two quick things. Capabilities, I've already said it. The reason I wrote The Big Con is without capacity and capabilities, none of this happens. We end up getting captured by brochuremanship. This is all about different actors working well together. Well, they won't know how to work well together. And this mean-looking guy was a conservative Tory lord who, on the back of seeing how much money the UK government spent on consultants in Brexit, And COVID, again, 1.5 million a day on Deloitte for test and trace, said, what are we doing? We're infantilizing government. Those crunchy, wicked problems that we need our civil servants to learn from are being done by others. And what we did in the book was to unpick why that was happening. Read the book, it's just come out. I don't have time to talk about it, but you know more than I do of what the problems are with your own net zero strategy, which your Minister for Climate Change and Energy called a scamflet, scam on zero. But we don't blame the consultants, we blame governments and also a consulting industry that has no incentive to make sure that at the end of a contract, end of a relationship, that actor on the government side is any better, because otherwise you won't get the other, the contract. There's conflicts of interest in terms of being on both sides of the street. But why are governments, even when they have capacity, like the capacity that existed in Australia in different organizations and universities and CSIRO on climate, why is it so much easier to just go to a consultant because it's easy to rubber stamp that decision? And that goes back to this idea that it's fear, the fear of taking any risk. Why? Because this idea that you're just there to fix markets. We also look at what it's meant for the business sector, not admitting that the decisions that are being made by CEOs, like excessive buybacks, like downsizing, like mergers and acquisitions, are internal decisions. Oh, it was told to us to do it by someone else, that kind of rubber stamp. So it's really about bringing courage back into the system, admitting that these are choices, again, agency, and negotiating those choices and agency. That's why, again, this is about bringing a tense relationship into the system, but investing in those capacities and capabilities are crucial. Digital governance capabilities are crucial. We knew that with test and trace, but they are essential even to the climate agenda. Data, if our civil servants aren't being trained to think about digital governance as cross-cutting all missions, none of those missions will work. And this, safe place also to make mistakes. Gov labs are very important to learn from. It's almost like an internal consulting arm. In fact, there are some internal consulting arms popping out by governments who are trying to resist their consultification. But safe places where we admit that to do things differently in an outcomes-oriented way, it's not going to be easy. We need to experiment. And super lastly, that idea of participation that I opened up with. All of this ultimately has to be about designing better systems, about getting that public, private, capital, labor, citizen groups together and actually finding solutions to our local, to our national, and to our global problems. And what does it mean to actually take seriously participatory structures and that kind of co-creation, meaning that what the missions are themselves need to be decided together. Personally, I have learned a lot from work that I've done with cities. It's much easier in local councils and local cities to also bring together different voices, and that also means that it's important to then learn how to do that properly locally and then scale up those lessons nationally. But then the money ideally would then flow in the opposite way. But that's why, learning by doing on how to truly bring different voices to the table is something that personally I think economists have nothing to teach, and why we need to embed learning from those who've actually, in the sciences, by the way, it's more anthropologists and psychologists that have looked at this, definitely not economists, but those bold, I'd say, also leaders who've actually done this in a non-tokenistic way. And I learned a lot in Camden, my part of London, where, for example, the Clean Growth Mission that Georgia Gould, the London councillor, embarked on with work that we did with Camden Council. The first thing was to actually bring resident associations, citizen associations to the table to even talk about what kind of clean growth mission do we want, and how do we make sure that agency, dignity, well-being is at the center of that. For example, the food banks that rose during COVID, turning them into food cooperatives, green food cooperatives, so that idea of ownership actually embedded in the governance of the institutions. Participatory budgeting in Brazil, very interesting example. Again, I'm going to just rush through these last couple slides because I'm way beyond time, but also the idea of trade unions, which got us the weekend, got us holidays, got us sick pay, and so on, they have to be very much also at the center of this negotiation. That's the idea of the just transition. In countries like Australia, where trade union membership has been falling, what does it actually mean to bring labor's voice to the table of what a just transition looks like? It's very interesting what just happened in the US. I was really surprised how little the papers talked about this. The UAW, the United Auto Workers, just had a strike against all three automobile companies, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. And the reason was that the battery producers for electrification were earning a third less than unionized workers in those companies. So Trump, who comes along and says, hey, the green transition is bad for you, it's bad for wages, it's bad for skills, actually had a point. It was becoming bad for workers. So that strike, which actually was a victory, was a successful strike, was a very important moment where admitting that there's nothing natural in the just transition, it has to be negotiated, right? Pulling up all boats instead of it becoming good for some and not good for others. So let me just finish by saying, as I said in the beginning, this is about changing the story, changing the theory, changing the practice, learning from the practice, trying to actually implement a different system, outcomes orientation, symbiotic, public-private partnerships, co-creation at the center of that process. It has to be underpinned by real new economic thinking around all the different issues I've talked about value, about markets, not as fixed but co-created, those dynamic capabilities in all organizations if they are to produce value together and not just de-risk each other, outcomes-oriented finance, pre-distributive ways to tackle inequality, ex ante, not picking up the mess ex post, bringing in true participation through reciprocity and this kind of idea of conditionality at the center of any contract and really unpicking those contracts, and that idea of participation, co-designing the future as opposed to just saying this is good for you. The green transition is good for you as opposed with you, actually defining what it means. And my own institute, the reason I set it up was changing this vocabulary is hard, but it needs to be nested within that new economic thinking. And thank you, and I'm so sorry that I went over again for the 5th time this week.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Fortunately, we're not letting Mariana go just yet. I'd like to bring to the stage for the fireside chat component of this evening Professor Dan Hill, who's the director of the Melbourne School of Design and formerly visiting professor of practice at UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Professor Dan Hill, who knows Professor Mazzucato very well, and so I'm looking forward to a great discussion, and we will also open it up to questions. Over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm still actually a visiting professor at IOPP, as far as I know, unless Mariana's changed that and not emailed me about it. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for coming, and thank you, Mariana, for that. The only person I know that can follow Mariana Mazzucato is Mariana Mazzucato, so I'm going to give you as much time as possible here. And then I get to race through some things there, so we might go back to a few things. You met Jim Chalmers on Monday. What did he say?
Oh. It was a short dialogue, but for me it was, why is he attracted to these ideas? Why is he citing mission economy? It's interesting when I don't even know a politician and then I'm just told, there's a newspaper article or there's an article that this person has written saying that they've read your book and they're inspired by it, but then they're not necessarily changing what they're doing. So for me, the question was, how does this concept then land in Australia? What are the opportunities that he sees for it, but also in the everyday? What are the opportunities for actually changing policies, which frankly have been part of the problem, right? Just like this excessive use of tax incentives for R&D in a low investment economy is there, the willingness, if you want to change that. And he actually gave me a really interesting example of something they did very quickly, and he said, I think he said it wasn't confidential. This is terrible. I should be more. But he said that when they took away the patent box policy as one of the first things they did, there was actually no pushback. And the patent box policy is something that in almost all my books I have given as an example of this rentier kind of policy that is lobbied for by some companies, in this case pharmaceutical companies, that present themselves as the innovation machine, but actually do a lot of lobbying for getting these excess rents, which both NASA and Adam Smith were against. So patents are already a monopoly. You get 17 years of monopoly profits. There's no reason for taxes to be reduced on those profits coming from a 17-year monopoly. And the patent box policy was that, tax reduction on a 17-year monopoly. So that was an example he gave on something that they were doing around that, but the bigger question of what does a mission-oriented industrial strategy look like? And he said that the net zero ambition in Australia is where this idea of mission orientation has to land.
Yeah, no, thank you. Because we've known each other a long time, I might ask you a few cheeky questions like that along the way. But one thing I wanted to, one thing that I immediately found interesting about your approach to work when we first met, I think I was in Treviso and you were from Padova.
Oh, you were in Benetton.
Exactly.
Oh my God.
But you talked to me despite being in Treviso. Was this focus on practice, not just theory? I mean, the theory is there in your work, of course. The value of everything, as you said, goes right back to the foundations of the idea of value in economics. Your new book on common good, you told me the other day, there's going to be quite a lot of philosophy in there, as far as I can tell. So the theory is there, but you have always shown this interest in practice, in the doing of things. And what I find fascinating about your institute is that you're working, as you said, with Camden, Barbados, Brazil, Colombia, across the USA and the UK. From that, how do you characterize the new kind of capabilities that you see emerging in that work that you do with government around practice? What kind of distinctive new capabilities are there?
Well, first of all, these countries are very, very different one from another. And for example, the reason I'm very interested in the work I'm doing in Brazil is that the ecological transition goal and mission is actually nested within the finance ministry. And that, to me, is the biggest hurdle, usually. What usually happens is the interesting missions, whether it's on health or housing, well-being, climate, are done in the Ministry of the Environment and the Ministry of Housing, and then the Finance Ministry continues to work like it did before, and yet if the problems are coming from that ways of working that were there before, none of these other missions will ever change that. Change how the economic system is working for, again, people and planet. So having these ambitions in the treasuries, in the finance ministries, in some countries you have Ministry of Economy and and the finance ministry separate, but let's just combine them for a second here, in the finance ministry, then that means that the structure of finance has to change. One of the problems with seeing things as market failures is this idea of a financing gap, right? That you just need to put money into a hole because there's lack of finance in an area, as opposed to changing the structure of finance. Again, what does a public fund look like? How is it governed? What does it mean to put a mission-oriented outlook and governance structure on that public fund that is much more easy to do and interesting to do when that fund then is inside the Ministry of Finance, so that the way that we think about finance, money creation, what is money? Is money just a medium of exchange? Or does the structure of finance, the structure of the monetary system affect what happens in the real economy? This was the big debate between Keynes and Minsky versus the Miller-Modigliani theorem, which said money is neutral. It's just greasing the wheels of commerce. So that's one big capability, I think, putting these missions at the center and not the periphery. And then the practice of an outcomes-oriented finance. What does that look like? The experience I had in Scotland was that opened a huge can of worms, and especially, it's not just the skills inside, but also on the outside. How do you combat then the accusation that you're crowding out? The BBC is accused of crowding out. The KfW is accused of crowding out. I'm sure Breakthrough is probably accused of crowding out. And so it's not just about defending the organizations and saying, no, they're crowding in. how do you make sure you're not crowding out? And the irony is when you're not doing your job, when you're not being ambitious, and you end up doing what the private sector should do but is not doing, then actually you are crowding out in also another way because you're just allowing one side to get off scot-free. The real crowding out accusation is you're taking up too much space, right? And you're crowding business out. But the actual crowding out, I think, happens when you're almost crowding out the ambition because you end up doing something easy, maybe also because you've brought in someone from the private sector to run that public fund that maybe doesn't have a real sense of public purpose. And many people in the private sector do have, by the way, a sense of purpose. But if you haven't brought in also the right leadership and governance structures, then it's not surprising, as we've seen in many government institutions, that these static metrics come in to measure what the public sector has done. That's the overuse of cost-benefit analysis, the overuse of net present value calculations instead of, some of the examples I said before, which themselves are capabilities. Dynamic metrics to measure those spillover effects along the way is a capacity and a capability.
Yeah, so the Treasury is also interesting, I suppose, because it's the one place, in a sense, that has a helicopter view across all of the other ministries, as in everybody's budget ends up there sooner or later or is derived from there, I guess.
Actually, I should say the best model is when it's not necessarily in the Treasury. In Colombia, for example, they have it's called the DNP, the Department for National Planning, which sits above all the ministries, including the finance ministry. So the missions, ideally, we're working with the government of Colombia, should sit there. And then the question for finance is, what does that mean for finance?
Yes, and so which brings me to a follow-on there. Obviously, you could get a very, the view through the lens of finance could be quite reductive in a sense. So,
exactly.
So
good point.
The other interesting thing I found about your work when we worked together on the mission-oriented strategy, industrial strategy for the UK, was that not only did you bring me in, thank you, a designer onto the mobility stuff, but you also brought in Brian Eno, an artist and a musician, who you'd think would be probably one of the last people that the government would allow into a room to talk about the future of mobility, a very technical, infrastructural, capital-intensive, all of those kinds of adults in the room style words. And yet, Eno, I think, made probably the breakthrough moments in that work. Do you want to say a bit about what made you think of doing that? How did you have to fight for that? And what kind of capabilities does that way of thinking bring to the table as well?
So I don't know if you were in the meeting, but one of the best meetings was when Brian Eno it was actually the mission on sustainable mobility, which you contributed to immensely, where he said, hold on a second, why do we keep assuming that the point is to go from point A to point B quicker? What if it's about slowing down? And he didn't say smoking, but he said, slowing down and experiencing, right, things in a different way, which is interesting actually, because the Bartlett School of the built environment, the kind of your collegial, I don't know if it's a competitor or friend.
They're almost as good
but
as
my
us.
institute is in the Bartlett, They're actually number one. They have this thing called space syntax, which is, how you build your streets. Just like what I said before about money is not neutral. The structure of the monetary and financial system affects what happens in the real economy. How you build our cities, but literally at the street level, affects how people live, right? I mean, it's an obvious point, but kind of breaking down that point was almost like what Brian Eno was talking about. What does it mean to have a sustainable mobility strategy that pays just as much attention on the experience that you're having, right? As an artist, it's not surprising. Oliver Eliasson, another artist I've worked with, talks a lot about experience. When he built that big block of ice at the famous Paris COP conference that people could go touch to feel it melting, that idea that you need to experience things also to really live them, and how we build our streets. How are we building that feeling along the way? And it was interesting that an artist had to kind of wake us up in that meeting.
No, exactly. And I distinctly remember it was almost like a very sort of mic drop moment from Brian Eno. It stopped the conversation in its tracks and then skewed it in a completely different, far more productive and interesting direction, which opened up the kind of things that you saw there.
By the way, the arts are getting completely screwed by this static metrics.
Well, that's what I was going to get onto. So how do you think about the value that brings in, again, a very often reductive way of thinking about value?
So Frances Morris just resigned, actually, but she was the head of the Tate Modern, which is a beautiful public museum in London. And she said, If I listened to the Treasury based on their static metrics, all I would do would be blockbuster shows. You know, Cezanne, Picasso, or whatever, because it's all based on ticket sales and very static metrics to judge the success of the museum. And she said, and yet my success has been notwithstanding the fact that those metrics exist. What I've tried to do, she said, but it's very hard when the metrics are the wrong ones, is to bring people into the museum that have never set foot in a museum before in their lives, and to showcase artists that are marginalized and not usually allowed and able, because they've been excluded, to showcase their art in those kind of museums. And even just those two examples, were her going against the system.
Yeah.
And then why be ahead of a museum where you have to go against the system in order to do what really, you know, why you entered that profession in the first place?
No, exactly. So the other thing I found interesting about these capabilities, going back 2 steps, was your sense of, again, the very reductive nature of cost-benefit analysis. And would you like to say a little bit more about the kind of different ways of thinking that through that capture the sort of exponential growth or the spillover effects of something, not linear results on something? Are you seeing that kind of capability emerging in governance at all?
I mean, it has, no. The answer is no, but it has to, because remember, people sometimes forget how important Keynes was. So before World War II, there was not just recessions, but depressions constantly. Basically, every 15 years, there was a depression. We all remember 1929. Just look at the data. I don't know how your data, your economic data is here, but in America, it's freely available. You can download the data for the last 250 years, and you can see it. You see a constant depression, and also deflation, because what happens when you have depressions is prices, you know, fall, which is very bad for anyone who has savings, like pensioners and so on. So a little bit of inflation is a natural consequence of having stable growth. And the reason we ended up getting stable business cycles where we had recessions but not depressions, as Keynes comes in, is like, duh. Guess why this is happening? In a recession, if business cuts investment, if consumers stop consuming, because it's a recession, like we've had recently, and if government on top of that also cuts back, recessions will turn into depressions because of that vicious cycle of everyone's cutting. If government instead, he says, does counter-cyclical investment and spending, so in bad times actually pumps in more money, as public banks tend to do. When private banks are cutting lending in bad times, public banks should be doing the opposite, then that at least breaks that cycle.
Yeah.
And then he also, his other big contribution, in fact, kind of mild inflation, 2 to 5%, is a new phenomenon since World War II as a consequence of stabilizing the business cycle. But the multiplier, which was his other big thing, which is, guess what? If you do this smartly, or if you just do it, it creates a multiplier. So for each dollar or pound or whatever of public investment, then that creates the opposite of a vicious cycle. It creates a virtuous cycle, because someone who's been paid to make a bridge then goes and uses that money to buy something, and the person, the shopkeeper, then buys that kind of multiplicative effect. Yes, that is there, but what actually is causing it? If it's just helicopter money, if you just have like a redistributive policy, or just let's throw a lot of money at homes, right? And without a strategic vision, without a mission orientation, without a way to get public and private to truly work well together, and to create additionality in the system to get the private sector to do their job, which is to invest. My friend who used to run a public bank in Brazil used to say Brazil is capitalism without capitalists, because they don't invest enough. So it's funny that a socialist has to say, come on, capitalists, do your job, invest, instead of just sitting back waiting for rents. Then actually you don't get the multiplier effect. So the multiplier effect is a key measure, actually. It's a metric, right? Just like this dynamic spillovers along the way, but you don't get those dynamic spillovers without policies that actually create it, because if it's just handouts, subsidies, guarantees, tax reductions, overuse, as you do here, of tax incentives, you actually don't get that multiplier effect. Yeah. You get public investment, you get public money, so it looks like, hey, the public sector is out there doing something, but actually doesn't cause that. It just causes more rents in the system. Yeah. And the difference between profits and rents, by the way, which was something that the classical economists really cared about, is increasingly hard to differentiate when we have a national accounting system that simply puts anything that has a price into GDP. So if you marry your babysitter, GDP goes down, so don't do it. If you pollute, GDP goes up, right? Because you got to pay someone to. So if we just confuse price with value and don't do what the physiocrats did, which is to make sure that we even know the difference between value creation and value extraction, it's not surprising that GDP actually is full of rent.
Yeah. So I suppose the corollary, I mean, absolutely, you're very clear on this directionality of the investment in R&D, for instance, or the investment in innovation generally. But I suppose the corollary of that, there is a capacity question as well, and you pointed to this, I guess, in Australia. We're not top of the list, we're towards the bottom. I was looking up today, I think the GERD, which is the gross expenditure on R&D in the country, so public plus private investment, is about 38 billion Australian dollars, which is about 25 billion US dollars-ish. Apple spends 30 billion on R&D single-handedly. So one American company of 164,000 people spends more on R&D than a country of 25 million, by about 6 billion. So there is also an issue with just the amount of the quantum as well as the direction to some degree, do you think?
Well, there's a couple things there. First of all, AI, which everyone's talking about today, one thing that's not talked about enough is all the talent around artificial intelligence is for the first time actually in history, where there was a lot of talent also in the DARPAs, the NASAs, and other public agencies like your own, increasingly just in the private sector. But why is that? Where does this money come from? Where do the billions, the excess profits come from that then can pay these massive salaries, which have seen a hemorrhaging of top talent from universities to big tech companies? And if you look at the amount of tax evasion, Apple, by the way, just to avoid a massive amount of tax, moved its headquarters from Cupertino, California to Reno, Nevada at one point, and just from that move saved $3 billion. Inside the U.S., state to state, that year, the deficit actually of California went up by that same amount. I'm not saying it was 1-for-1, but the point is, it's not unrelated when states or governments have to cut back or feel that they have to cut back. It's absolutely related to this tax evasion. Amazon doesn't treat its workers very well. Amazon drivers have to pee in bottles often. Ken Loach has done great movies on this. Yeah. So if you factor in the financialization of the company, so the relationship with the stock market, if you factor in exploitation of labor, think of the Amazon model. If you factor in the free riding off of public technology, what would Google be without the NSF-funded grant? What would it be without the internet publicly financed? What would Uber be without GPS publicly financed? This is the kind of sharing risks and rewards, which I didn't really get to, but also the tax evasion, labor exploitation, financialization. I could go on and on. Those excess profits would not be there. It would be much, much lower. And there's actually a lot more to be said about that. But the point is, the last thing then we need is those excess profits get put into philanthropies like the Bezos Earth Fund, which 0.01% of Amazon profits created from these rentier kind of business models then go into a foundation which then helps the UN on the climate goals. But also these huge amounts of money that can then pay scientists to go into those companies. It's a huge problem because that capacity and capability that should also be in our decentralized public institutions is actually not there. Now, it's the first time, AI, it's the first time that I've seen, at least if you look at the history of technology, that there's this massive skewed location of where the talent sits. And I just think that needs to be addressed. And there's plenty of scientists that are driven by public purpose and not just money. But these things are related. Excess profits, salaries, foundations, that kind of so-called ecosystem of funding that we currently see for the next wave of big technology is, again, not neutral, and it's something that should be talked about much more explicitly.
Thank you. And I'm just going to switch to a few questions from the audience, and there's a code up there, the QR code, if you want to keep adding them. We've got tons of questions here, predictably. I'll pick 3. Yeah. There's one here. There's a story in Mission Economy about a 26-year-old engineer solving an Apollo lander failure. We don't let 26-year-olds make PowerPoint slides unsupervised. I have to say this person's never clearly been to Whitehall. As far as I can tell, Whitehall's full of 21-year-old Oxford PPE graduates and nothing else. But anyway, how do we devolve and empower the decision-making in the way that would enable, for instance, that breakthrough moment on Apollo that came from arguably an unlikely direction in the hierarchy?
Yeah, well, two things. The average age in the Apollo mission room was 26, which is actually incredible. And there's two issues here. One is what attracts top young people to even want to be civil servants. That idea of missions actually makes it much more attractive, right? Like, would you want to go work in an organization that sees its role as de-risking Elon Musk, and at best creating a carbon tax, or an organization that sees itself at the center of a green transition, making green investments, but also steering a recovery program, which, by the way, happened in the US after the financial crisis when we all did austerity. I can't remember what you guys did, but definitely in the UK and in Europe, it was, as I said before, austerity galore. The US didn't do that. Again, this is counter to what everyone thinks about the US. They had a massive stimulus program, $800 billion. And it was green directed, and because that was really ambitious, Obama was able to recruit a Nobel Prize winning physicist, a Chinese American called Steve Chu, who ran the Department of Energy, set up an ARPA-E, like DARPA that did the internet, but for energy. Today, by the way, on the back of COVID, there's an ARPA-H. Made it really attractive for top people to go in there. Arun Majumdar ended up being the head of ARPA-E, later became Google's head of energy. Right. So the talent went, that way. So when you don't have mission-oriented organizations that aren't seen as being at the center of value creation, is it such a surprise that it looks more attractive to go work, whether it's in Goldman Sachs, Google, or McKinsey? I mean, that's a whole other thing. But the other point is after the Apollo 1 program failed, those 3 astronauts died, NASA changed its bureaucracy. Why? That was just a symptom of a problem they had, which was very vertical. Is this even on? Bureaucracy. One of the astronauts who died, I told the story last night. By the way, apologies for anyone who came last night, but this is more or less the same lecture, but with slides. But I was told that you would be a different audience. Gus Grissom, one of the astronauts who died, yelled, because they then got burnt to death. He said, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because they couldn't hear what was being said in Mission Control Room, and Mission Control Room couldn't hear them. So what did NASA do in the back of that? Did they just say, oh, we're so bureaucratic, we're so inertial, we're just government? No, they said, we got to change our bureaucracy. Yeah. We're going to become agile, flexible project managers, each with their delegated teams, but in constant communication one with the other. I should have put up the structure. It's actually very interesting. So it wasn't like, oh, we need to go to an MPA program and decide how to be purpose-oriented. They were purpose-oriented. They had to get to the moon and back in a quick amount of time. So they had to change their bureaucracy. They realized they had to be agile, flexible with horizontal communication. Yeah. Why do we have governments that are vertical, that are bureaucratic, that are slow? That's not unrelated to the fact that they're not mission-oriented. Because if you truly are, just like with COVID, where for a moment there we woke up, you had that kind of literally that war room with the different departments talking to each other, right? Because I had to, because COVID then exhibited itself in our lives in so many different ways. It wasn't just a health problem, right? So education was critical because of the lockdown. So I think the question is both what makes it attractive for a 26-year-old to enter government, but also how can government bureaucracies become creative bureaucracies? As you know, that's a common theme in IAPP. And if we do that, you can bet that we're going to have a much more bigger wave of young people and dynamic people wanting to work in government.
Yeah. So I'll do last question. I've just pleaded for one more.
Sorry.
But no, it's fine. You didn't do a very good job about selling your MPA a minute ago, so I'll give you...
Oh, no, our MPA is the best MPA because we go against...
Fine. I'll give you another chance to do it. So the Master of Public Administration, there's a question here about that, which is, what would your ideal Master of Public Policy or Administration teach its students? But I think I'll flip that around, because you can go to the website and see what the curriculum is for the MPA. Yeah. But maybe ask a bit more about the students on it. What kind of students do you get taking the MPA? Why do you think they go? Where do they come from, and where do they go next?
Sure. I mean, the reason I set up the Institute, which is actually a department, meaning that we have our own education program, is I deeply believe that you can't have better policy, you can't have better partnership with others, because this isn't just about government. As I've said, it's about collective intelligence, and I just think the government side has been under-theorized, without a new education. of how people in government are trained. And the current MPA programs that are available everywhere are coming from the market failure theory, where you're fixing market failures, and public choice theory and new public management, and all those metrics that then are used, that I've already talked about, the static metrics, are part of the training, right? So if you want something different, you need to provide a different curriculum. It can't just be a policy design and you still train everyone the same way. And as you know, our curriculum is based on 4 key pillars: rethinking value, collectively value creation; purpose-oriented, mission-oriented policies is the second; creative bureaucracies is the third; and design thinking and digital governance are kind of put together in that 4th module, but all complemented by that new economic thinking that underlies that. Right, that lessons from Schumpeter, lessons from Keynes, lessons from Minsky, but across that whole bit there, again, money is not neutral. And the kind of students that have been attracted to the program are, first of all, they're global. They're super, super smart, because this is a very attractive program. It's really one of the only ones, which, again, thinks about the administrative capacity of governments. That's why it's an MPA, not an MPP. MPP, it's too easy to just think of great policies, but administrative capacity, that's why we have businesses. MBA is because we know businesses need to create value, they need to administer, they need new tools, they need new thinking. So that's why it's an A and not a P, but it has to be underpinned with the new curriculum, and the students we get are both students who've been in the civil service or who want to go into the civil service, but many, I'd say almost half, who've worked in the private sector or even consulting, and who've been very disappointed with the way public and private have worked together. And that's the bit, actually, that's kind of the most interesting, because it's the non-obvious one. But in order, again, to put collective intelligence in the system, business has an incentive, finance has an incentive to be working also with better partners on the government side. And government has definitely an incentive not to get captured by brochuremanship, as Ernest Brackett said back in the 1960s, and to work well with others for the public interest, for the public good, for the common good, which is more than a correction, but an objective where the how matters as much as the what. God, I'm just repeating myself.
No, you're not.
Yeah, he's like, you are. Can you stop? Time.
No, but it is time.
Time.
No, thank you very much, Mariana. I think we've, to your point about value, I think we've squeezed about another 30 minutes of value out of you, so which wasn't on the books.
Sorry.
No, not at all. So thank you so much, Mariana Mazzucato. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. And Professor Mazzucato, it's been a busy week.
Yeah.
It's been, and really appreciate and value all the time and the insights. I would like to just bring the session tonight to a close by thanking everyone for coming. I'd also like to thank again our partners. Being here at Melbourne University is wonderful. And all of our other partners on the screen, this has been a great week. It's been so exciting and energising, and I'm really delighted that everybody's here. To everyone around Australia, if you're still on the live stream, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much. We're drawing it to a close. Book signing out the front. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.